Hey, sweetheart, you lost? The civilian petting zoo's by the front gate. This here's a working mess. Marines only. The voice carried the length of the hall. It was built to. Sergeant Mark Maddox had a parade ground baritone, and he used it like a man who had never once been told to lower it. 300 Marines filled the dining facility at Camp Lejeune that Monday, 1100 hours. The air thick with the smell of fryer oil and burnt coffee and floor wax. Trays clattered. Boots scraped tile. And at the far end of a long steel table sat a woman in a faded field jacket and jeans, a plain visitor lanyard around her neck, eating her lunch as though the loudest man in the room had said nothing at all. She did not look up. She did not need to. She had counted the exits before he finished his first sentence. 2 doors, 1 serving line, a fire lane behind the milk cooler that nobody used. She sat with her back to the bulkhead and a clean angle on both exits. And she had chosen that seat the way other people chose a seat near the window, without thinking, because 38 years of breathing had taught her body to do it for her. The fork moved. The food went down. Her eyes, when they moved at all, moved slow. Maddox came closer. He was 27, built like a man who lived in the gym and wanted you to know it. And he wore the small confidence of someone who had never met anyone he could not outshout. He flicked the edge of her lanyard with 1 finger. "Tourist," he said, to his table more than to her. 4 junior Marines sat there, and 3 of them laughed on cue. "We get 1 a week. They wander in off a base tour and think the chow hall's a museum exhibit." He let the word museum sit in the air, pleased with the shape of it. The hall was his stage, and had been for 2 years, since the morning he had won the battalion combative's belt, and decided the win entitled him to rule the 1 room every Marine had to enter 3 times a day. He knew the cooks by name, and the weak ones by instinct. A boot who held his fork like a child, a clerk who flinched at a raised voice, a staff sergeant past his prime who took the long way around Maddox's table. He collected them the way some men collect grudges, and he spent them for laughs, and nobody above him had ever cared enough to make him stop. The woman in the field jacket was simply the newest thing on the shelf, and he intended to get a full lunch hour out of her. The 4th Marine did not laugh. Private First Class Eddie Salas was 19 and 3 weeks out of the School of Infantry, and he had the careful stillness of a boot who had already learned that laughing at the wrong thing cost you. He looked at his tray. "You eat slow for a civilian," Maddox said. He planted a hand on the table and leaned into her space. "You even allowed in here? You got a sponsor, or did you just follow the smell?" "I have a badge," the woman said. Her voice was level and unhurried. She did not raise it to meet his. "A badge?" He grinned at the room. "She has a badge." He waited for more. People like Maddox always waited for more, for the stammer, or the flush, or the nervous laugh that told them the hook had set. None of it came. The woman set her fork down, squared it against the edge of her tray, and folded her hands. She looked at him then, finally, and there was nothing in her face he could use. No fear, no anger. Just a flat, patient attention, the way a person looks at weather. A civilian, in his experience, did one of 2 things under that kind of pressure. They folded, eyes down, and gave him the small win. Or they puffed up, quoted some half-remembered rule about harassment, and gave him a bigger one. This woman did neither. She held his eyes for exactly as long as it took to confirm he had nothing useful to offer, and then she let her gaze drift back to her tray. And the drift was the insult, though he could not have said why. She had filed him. That was the feeling, though he had no word for it. He had been weighed by someone who did this for a living, and found to be exactly what he appeared to be, and set back down. It unsettled him for half a breath. He covered it with volume. "Enjoy your visit," he said, and slapped the table once, hard enough to jump her milk carton, and walked off laughing. By the coffee urn, Master Gunnery Sergeant Eli Brandt had stopped pouring. Brandt was 50 and had been a Marine since before Maddox could read. He was the battalion operations chief, the kind of senior enlisted who knew where every body was buried and had dug a few of the holes himself. He had not been watching Maddox. Maddox he had seen 1,000 times. He had been watching the woman, and he could not have told you why, except that something in the way she had mapped the room before she ever lifted her fork had snagged on an old memory. A memory with no picture attached to it, only a feeling and a sound he could not place. He took one step toward her table. The memory came up half an inch, the way a name does when you stop reaching for it. Master Guns. The battalion duty officer was at the hatch, holding a clipboard. Need you for the range count. Brandt held up one finger. He looked back at the woman. She had picked her fork up again. The memory slid under the surface and was gone. He went. At the hatch, he looked back one more time. He still could not name it. But it had a weight now. The weight of a thing you know you will remember at 3 in the morning. And he carried it out the door, with him, into the rest of his day. The woman finished her lunch. She bussed her own tray, wiped her own spot on the table with a napkin, and walked out past Maddox's table without a glance. Salas watched her go. So did the milk carton she had set back upright, with 2 fingers, perfectly centered, as if order were a habit she could not switch off. The next day she came back. It was 1200 hours, and the hall was at its fullest, when the boy 2 tables over stopped making noise. Salas had been laughing at something, a piece of grilled chicken half swallowed, and then the laugh caught and turned into nothing. No cough, no wheeze, just a young Marine with both hands at his throat and his face going the color of putty and his eyes wide and climbing toward panic. The Marines around him half rose. One thumped his back, uncertain. Another said his name like a question. Maddox, 2 seats down, turned with his tray in his hands and froze, because a man who polices a room for sport has no idea what to do when the room actually needs something. The woman was already moving. She crossed 4 meters before Maddox set his tray down. She did not run. She arrived. One hand found the flat of Salas's sternum, the other wrapped under his arms, and she pivoted him up out of the bench in a single motion, her own base low and square. 5 abdominal thrusts, sharp and upward, her lips moving in a count nobody could hear. The chicken came free on the 4th. She turned him, swept his mouth with one hooked finger, and then she had 2 fingers under the angle of his jaw, reading his pulse, watching his pupils, talking the whole time in a low, even voice that did not change pitch once. You're okay. Air's moving. Look at me. Small sips when I tell you. Not yet. Look at me. 30 seconds, start to finish. Maybe less. The hall had gone quiet around the small island of it. Salas dragged in a breath that shook, then another, and the color came back into his face, in a rush that made him grab the table. The woman eased him down onto the bench. She slid a glass of water in front of him and put her hand flat between his shoulder blades. Small sips. 4 counts in, 4 counts out. You're fine. You're going to feel it in your throat for a day. That's normal. Ma'am, a staff sergeant said, arriving late and breathless, notepad already out, the reflex of every senior Marine to write the thing down. Ma'am, what's your name? I need to put this in the pass-down. There's nothing to put in the pass-down, she said. She was already gathering her own tray. He swallowed wrong. He's fine. Watch him drink. But you. Watch him drink. She said it gently, and it ended the conversation. The hall exhaled around the small island of it. The gunnery sergeant who ran the serving line had come around the steam tables at a dead run and arrived just in time to have nothing to do. And he stood there with his towel over his shoulder and watched a stranger hand his Marine back to him, breathing. A cook leaned out the pass-through window. A corporal who had been half out of his seat sat back down slowly. Salas had both hands wrapped around the water glass, and the shake in them was easing, and he kept stealing looks at the woman the way you look at a thing you are not sure was real. Somebody at the next table said, "Low, that was fast," and somebody else said nothing, because there was nothing to add. The whole event had lasted less time than it takes to tie a boot, and it had rearranged something in the room that would not rearrange back. She carried her tray back to the far table and sat down and picked up her fork. Within a minute, she was eating again, unhurried, as if the last half-minute had belonged to some other woman who had stepped out of her body and then stepped back into her seat. Maddox could not let it stand. He had watched a civilian do in 30 seconds what he had stood frozen through, and he had felt every eye in his table register it, and the math of his whole identity did not allow that to be true. So he rewrote it. He sat back down, loud again, and told his table it was luck. "Relax," he said, waving a hand. "Anybody can thump a back. You hit a guy hard enough between the shoulders, the food comes up. She got lucky on a boot, that's all. Don't make it a thing." But his junior Marines were not looking at him. They were looking at the woman at the far table and at Salas, who was drinking his water in small sips, 4 counts in and 4 counts out, exactly the way she had said. The staff sergeant stood in the middle of the hall with his pen over a blank page. He looked down at the notepad. He had her face, and he had 30 seconds of competence he would think about for a week, and he did not have a single thing to write, because the woman had walked off before he got a name. He had nothing. The save had happened and erased its own author, and the only proof it had occurred at all was a 19-year-old breathing carefully 2 tables away, and a fork rising and falling at the end of the hall as if nothing in the room could touch the person holding it. Maddox was a simple instrument, and shame in a simple instrument comes out as cruelty. He could not let the mess hall believe a civilian had outclassed him, so over the next 2 days, he turned the room into a stage and gave it a running bit. Every time the woman entered the hall, his table started a slow mock clap. Somebody would call out, "The medic," in a falsetto. He told Boots at the serving line, loud enough to carry, not to sit near the tourist, or they would catch civilian on them. It was small, and it was relentless, and it worked the way these things work, which is that nobody joined in and nobody stopped it either. And the silence of 300 people is its own kind of permission. It built across 2 days. On the first, he kept it to the slow clap and the falsetto. On the second, he got bolder, because boldness that goes unpunished always gets bolder. He started narrating her, a sportscaster of small cruelties, describing her tray choices to the room, inventing a backstory in which she was a failed reporter, then a process server, then a woman who had wandered off from a memory care van. The juniors at his table laughed less each time, but they laughed, and the laughing was the fuel. A lance corporal named Ortiz, who had a conscience and not much spine, caught the woman's eye once across the hall and looked away first, ashamed. And that small private failure was its own quiet verdict on the whole room. He went after Salas too, because Salas was the soft target, and Maddox knew it. Careful, Salas. He caught the kid by the chow line on the second day, voice pitched for the room. Adopt enough strays, people start to wonder what kind of Marine you are. You need a civilian woman to save you from a chicken nugget. What happens when somebody's actually shooting? Salas stared at his tray and said nothing. His ears were red. The woman was 3 feet behind them in line. She did not say a word about the day before. She did not look at Maddox. She simply carried her tray to Salas's empty table and set her coffee down across from him and sat, and stayed. 2 minutes. A quiet wall of plain field jacket and patient silence between the boy and the sergeant. She talked about nothing. The weather. Whether the coffee was always this bad. By the time she rose, Maddox had drifted off to a louder table, and Salas was sitting up a little straighter, and nothing had been said about any of it. At the next table over, a visiting officer was losing a fight with an English-language travel claim form. He was a Jordanian major on a 2-week liaison visit, and he muttered at the paper in frustration in his own language, certain no one understood. "The block you want is the per diem code," the woman said, without looking up from her food. She said it in Arabic, the Levantine kind, fast and clean and idiomatic, the accent worn smooth by use. "Top right." They hide it on purpose. The major's head came up. He thanked her, startled, in the same language. She nodded and went back to her eggs. 2 Marines at the end of the table traded a look. Maddox, across the hall, heard nothing. She opened a small notebook then, not angrily, methodically. She wrote the date, the time, names where she had them, descriptions where she did not, what was said, and to whom, and who had laughed, and who had not. The pen moved in small, precise lines, and then stopped. Stop and sit with that for a second. 300 Marines in that hall. 300. One of their own instructors hunting a stranger and a teenage boot for sport, day after day, and not one person stood up. If that lands wrong in your chest, if it makes something tighten there, hold on to it. Do not let it go. You are going to want it later, and when you do, you will know what to do with it. The woman capped her pen. She closed the notebook. She looked up. Her face had not changed at all. Not a degree. That was the part that should have frightened Maddox. The absolute flatness of a person who is not keeping score in anger, but simply keeping the record straight. Because the record was going to matter, and she knew it. He did not see it. He was 3 tables away, telling a story with his hands. He did not see it, and so he did not stop. And the notebook went back into the inside pocket of the faded field jacket, and the woman finished her coffee. On the 5th day, Maddox stopped performing and started filing. It was a smarter form of the same instinct, and it nearly worked. He walked into the battalion duty hut at 0900 and reported an unescorted civilian who had been wandering secure spaces all week, who refused to give her name, who he believed was photographing Marines. None of it was true in the way that mattered, and all of it was true enough on paper. The battalion duty officer was a lieutenant 6 months in the fleet, drowning in a watch he did not understand. And when a squared-away sergeant put a complaint in front of him about a security concern, he signed the request to pull the visitor's credentials without asking a single question, because signing was faster than thinking, and the line behind Maddox was long. The flag went into the system. A junior admin clerk named Lance Corporal Pierce, 21, keyed it in. Visitor access, under review, pending escort. Pierce did not like it as he typed it. The complaint had no substance under it when you read it twice. Photographing Marines, it said. But there were no photos cited, no witness, but Maddox. No time, no place specific enough to check. It was the shape of a report without the weight of one. But a sergeant had signed his name to it, and a lieutenant had countersigned, and a lance corporal does not unwind 2 ranks above him on a Tuesday, so Pierce keyed it in and told himself it would sort out. The system took it without complaint. Systems always do. That was the part that bothered him later, how easily a true name could be turned into a flag by 2 signatures and a frightened officer, how the machine never once asked whether any of it was so. That afternoon, the woman was stopped at the hatch of the mess hall by a polite young corporal who explained, clearly embarrassed, that her badge had been flagged and she would need to wait outside the battalion spaces until it was sorted. She did not argue. That was the thing Pierce would remember later. Civilians argued. Civilians demanded supervisors and quoted rules they had half read. This woman just nodded once, the way you acknowledge an order rather than a request. It was at the hatch, waiting, that she did the small thing. A fire watch stood near the door, a young private with a rifle slung wrong, the muzzle drifting and the chamber flag missing from the ejection port. Most people would not have seen it. The woman saw it the way you see a stare that is not there. She stepped close and spoke low. One sentence, not a correction so much as a fact, handed over quietly. "Marine, your weapon's in an unsafe condition. Sling it muzzle down. Get a chamber flag in before your sergeant does it for you." The private looked at his own rifle, startled, and fixed it. He said, "Yes, ma'am," before he had decided to. Pierce, passing with a stack of folders, heard it and slowed. That was not how a lost civilian talked. That was not the vocabulary of a tourist. Unsafe condition. Chamber flag. The words landed wrong against the visitor lanyard, and the wrongness lodged in Pierce's head and sat there. The woman did not press the badge issue. She signed the access review form the corporal handed her, asked for a copy, and folded it into the notebook with the rest. Then she walked out to the parking lot and stood by a rented sedan and made one short call on her own phone, to a number she did not say out loud, and spoke for under a minute and hung up. By the end of the day, the stamp came back through the system. Access. Revoked. Pending escort. On paper, the incoming commander of 1st Battalion, 6th Marines, had just been barred from her own battalion by a lance corporal and a frightened lieutenant on the word of a martial arts instructor. The woman read the stamp on her phone in the parking lot. She folded the page along its old crease. She said nothing at all, and the saying of nothing was the loudest thing she had done all week. Master Gunnery Sergeant Brandt could not sleep on it. The memory from the chow hall had not let him go. It came up at odd hours, at the wheel, in the shower, that snag of something familiar in how the woman had moved. On the 7th evening, he was alone in the battalion operations shop, past 2200, and instead of going home, he pulled the visitor manifest. He found her line. The name was flagged with a maiden name notation, the way records are when someone has carried more than one over a career. And next to it sat a Department of Defense sponsor code that Brandt knew because he had spent 4 years attached to a joint task force and had learned to read the quiet codes that meant the person attached to them did not appear in the ordinary places. He sat back, and the memory finally came up all the way, because now it had something to hang on. 2019. Northern Syria. A 4-man fire team pinned in a courtyard with a wall coming down around them and the radios full of panic, and then a voice cutting through all of it. A woman's voice, flat and slow and certain, the calmest thing for 400 miles. He had never seen her face. He had been 29 and bleeding, and sure he was going to die against that wall. And the voice had talked them out of it one move at a time, and the voice had a call sign. He remembered the specifics, the way you only remember the worst nights, the way the voice never rose, the way it gave them one task at a time and never two, because two was how panicked men froze. Move to the low wall. Good. Now the gap, on my count. Good. He remembered believing the voice the way a drowning man believes a rope, with his whole body, before his mind had voted. 4 men had gone into that courtyard, and 4 men had come out, and not one of them had ever met the owner of the voice, because that was how it worked at that level. The people who saved you stayed ghosts. He had spent 7 years assuming the voice belonged to someone long gone, or long retired, or buried under a classification he would never see lifted. He had never once imagined it might be eating reconstituted eggs 40 feet from his coffee urn, while a sergeant called it a tourist. He said it out loud to the empty office. Blackthorn 6. He pulled up the security footage from the passageway, because some part of him had already half decided and wanted to be wrong. There it was, that afternoon, time-stamped. Maddox shoulder-checking the woman in the hall, hard, a deliberate thing dressed up as an accident, and the woman absorbing it, not stumbling, not even a half-step. Her base stayed under her, her weight settled and redistributed in the space of the contact, and she kept walking as if a heavy door had swung into her and she had simply let it. Brant rewound it. He watched it twice. You did not get that from a gym. You got that from years of people trying to put you on the ground and failing. He picked up the phone and called a retired sergeant major he had served with at the regiment, a man who now had access to nothing and knew everything. And he asked one question he had no business asking. "Humor me," Brant said, low, the door of the shop shut. "Blackthorn 6. That call sign mean anything to you?" A pause. Yeah, I'll wait." A longer pause, and Brant's free hand came up and pressed flat against his own mouth. You're sure it's the same one, and you're telling me she's stateside, right now? You're sure?" He set the phone down very carefully, the way you set down something that might go off. Here is where the two halves of this story were, that night. One sergeant tearing a stranger apart for sport, day after day, sure of the ground under his feet. And one master gunnery sergeant 3 buildings away, holding a name he could barely make himself believe, a name attached to the calmest voice he had ever heard on the worst night of his life, wondering how on God's earth he was supposed to say it out loud, and to whom. Stay in that gap with me. Feel how wide it is, because it is about to close, and when it closes, it is going to close all at once. Brant looked at the manifest. He looked at the flagged maiden name, and the sponsor code, and the revoked access stamp some boot lieutenant had signed. He said the call sign one more time, under his breath, to no one. Then he reached for his cover and his keys, and went looking for a colonel. She spent that last night before it broke in a rented room off Route 24. It was a spare place, motel plane, and Lieutenant Colonel Naomi Dixon sat on the edge of the bed, with a flat black case open on the blanket in front of her. Inside, on dark foam, lay a Navy cross. A folded note, soft at the creases from handling. A photograph of 5 operators on a rooftop, squinting into a hard white sun, young in the way that only people who are about to lose someone are young. She had come early, and in plain clothes on purpose. You do not learn a battalion from a slide deck. You do not learn it from the careful version the staff shows an incoming commander, all clean floors and rehearsed answers. You learn it from the chow line, from who laughs when a boot chokes and who moves, from which sergeant runs a room for sport, and which master gunnery sergeant watches the door. She had wanted to know what her Marines were before they knew what she was, and now she knew. And most of what she knew was good, and some of it was going to require a reckoning. That was the job. That had always been the job. And there had been good in it, plenty of good, more good than rot. She had watched a corporal in the chow line quietly pay for a boots meal when the kid's card got declined, and say nothing, and wave off the thanks. She had watched the serving line gunnery sergeant learn every Marine's name in his section, and use them. She had watched Brant run his shop like a man who still believed the work mattered. Late, when he thought no one was looking. A battalion is never one thing. It is a few hundred people being their best and their worst in the same building, and the commander's whole art is knowing which is which before it costs someone. She had needed 9 days in plain clothes to learn the shape of this one, and the shape was sound, with one bad joint that had been allowed to set wrong, and bad joints do not heal on their own. Somebody has to re-break them. That, too, was the job. Her eyes went to the photograph and stayed. Northern Syria. The compound at the edge of a dead town. 2 coalition air crew down inside the wire, and a Marine fire team pinned in the courtyard, and her element on the roof of the building across the street, with the whole night going wrong at once. She had been 36, and she had been the calm voice, because somebody had to be. And calm is a decision you make over and over, while your own pulse tries to talk you out of it. 23 minutes, 400 meters of bad ground, 6 souls to bring out, and she had brought out 5 of them on her count, wall by wall, one breath at a time. Blackthorn 6, I have your voice. Move on my count. 3, 2, move. She had said it so many times that night it had stopped being words and become a metronome, and men had walked out of a kill box to the beat of it. The sixth soul was Master Sergeant Diego Marrero. He had gone back. There was a man still inside, a wounded aircrew man who could not walk, and Diego had gone back through the breach for him with that grin he had, the one that said he already knew how this ended and was going anyway. He got the aircrew man to the wall. He did not come out behind him. The wall took an RPG a half-second after the aircrew man cleared it. Dixon had been on the roof across the street with the whole street in her headset, and she had felt the blast in her teeth before she heard it. And then the net had a hole in it, where Diego's voice had been. She had keyed the radio. She had said his call sign once, level, the way she said everything that night, and there had been no answer. And a second call would have told every man on that net what the silence meant, so she did not make a second call. She held the line. She gave the next task to the next man. She brought the air crew man and the fire team and her own people back across 400 meters of bad ground on a voice that never once let them hear what it cost to keep it flat. She brought 5 out. She went back for the 6th herself, after, when it was over. And she carried what was left of him out across her own shoulders in the gray before dawn. Dixon had carried Diego's call herself, on the net, in the same flat voice, because the voice was the only thing she had left to give the rest of them, and breaking it would have killed more than one man. She had not broken it. She had finished the count. She had brought the others home. The call sign was hers on paper. The Navy Cross was hers in a case. In the only ledger that mattered to her, both of them belonged to Diego Marrero, who had gone back. She did not cry. She had done her crying years ago, in a different room, and it had not brought him back, and it had not been a thing she could afford to do twice. She rested 2 fingers on his face in the photograph. Light, the way you touch something you do not want to smudge. Then she closed the case. She set her alarm for 0500. She turned off the light. The mess hall did not know any of this. The mess hall knew a tourist with a flagged badge. Tomorrow was the 9th day, and the 9th day was when the man decided a flagged badge meant the rules no longer applied to her at all. By noon, the hall was packed. Dixon had been escorted in by a sympathetic gunnery sergeant who thought the whole flag business was foolish and said so, just to eat, her lanyard still marked under review. Maddox saw the flag from across the room and read it the only way a man like Maddox reads anything, as license. The rules had a hole in them with this woman's name on it, and he meant to climb through. He met her at the end of the serving line, where the whole hall could see, and he started talking. Civilians who think they are special. Civilians who do not listen. Civilians who need to be shown where the line is. The monologue rolled out of him, performative and ugly, his table grinning behind him. Then he slapped the tray out of her hands. It hit the deck, and food went everywhere, eggs and gravy across the clean tile, the tray spinning on its rim with a sound that filled the silence that dropped over the room. The hall went still. Even Maddox's table stopped grinning. A tray on the deck of a working mess is a sound everyone knows, and a sound everyone hates, and it pulls every head in the room on reflex. 300 faces turned. Forsks paused. The serving line gunnery sergeant straightened behind the steam table, towel coming off his shoulder, sensing the shift before he saw the cause. For one held breath, the loudest man in the battalion had the whole audience he had always wanted, and not one person in it was laughing. The woman looked at the mess on the floor. Then she looked at him, level, and said nothing. And the nothing enraged him more than anything she could have said. From the next table, the Jordanian major was on his feet, a sharp word in Arabic, ready to step in. Dixon answered him in the same language, 2 words only, quiet and absolute, and the Major sat back down. Stand down. Maddox heard a language he did not know come out of the tourist's mouth, calm as a closed door, and it lit something in him that had been smoldering all week. You feel that? He stepped into her. That's what civilians get when they don't listen. You think you're better than this room? Smile for me, tourist. Go on. Smile. He hit her. Open hand, hard, across the face, hard enough to turn her head and snap the sound of it across a silent hall. And he laughed, half turned to his table, performing the laugh, selling it. She rolled with the strike. Her base never broke. Her head turned with the force of it and came back, and her weight stayed exactly where she had set it. And she did not lift a hand. She did not lift a hand. A woman who had put grown men on the ground in 3 countries took an open palm across the face from a 27-year-old instructor and let it land and kept her feet, because the math she was running had nothing to do with him and everything to do with 300 witnesses and a record that was almost complete. She crouched. She picked up the tray. She set it on the rail. Then she straightened, and she looked at him, and she smiled. It was small. It was almost private, almost kind. The smile of a person who has just heard the last piece of a puzzle click into place. There was nothing triumphant in it. There was only certainty. "Okay, Sergeant Maddox," she said. His name. Calm. The first time all week she had used it, and she used it the way you read a name off a page you have already written, like she had it somewhere in ink and was simply confirming the spelling. The laugh died in Maddox's throat for half a second. Something cold walked up the back of his neck. He did not know what the smile meant. He did not know how she knew his name, or why she had said it like that, like a verdict. He told himself it meant nothing. He told himself she was a beaten civilian putting on a brave face. He picked the laugh back up and turned away, and let his table carry it for him. He was wrong about the smile. He had until tomorrow to find out how wrong. 1,200 hours, the 10th day, and the hall was full and loud and ordinary when the hatch opened and the regimental commander walked in. Colonel Adrian Foss was not supposed to be remarkable that day. He was doing a pre-ceremony walk-through with the battalion sergeant major, the kind of thing colonels do before a change of command, putting eyes on the spaces. He came in mid-stride, talking, and the hall did what halls do when a colonel appears, a ripple of straightening backs and lowered voices. Master Gunnery Sergeant Brandt was waiting for exactly this. He had spent a sleepless night and a careful morning. He had made the calls. He had handed a colonel a name and a manifest and a piece of security footage, and he had asked for one thing, the right to be the one who said it, and it had been granted. Now he stood, and his voice came up out of his chest with 30 years of parade decks behind it, and it filled the dining facility, wall to wall. "Attention on deck!" 300 Marines came to their feet on reflex, benches scraping, trays forgotten. And Brandt did not stop there. He turned toward the far table, toward the woman in the faded field jacket with the flagged lanyard and the mark still faint on her cheek, and his voice cracked for the first time in years. "Ma'am," he came to attention facing her. "Blackthorn 6. It was you on the radio. Northern Syria. The courtyard. It was you the whole time. It was always you." Colonel Foss crossed the room. He stopped in front of the plain-clothed woman, and he rendered a hand salute, slow and exact, and he spoke so the whole hall could hear every word. "Marines, your incoming commanding officer, Lieutenant Colonel Naomi Dixon, Marine Raider Regiment, Navy Cross. She has been eating in your mess for 9 days." His eyes moved once, hard, across Maddox's table. "You will not find a better officer to follow, and some of you have a great deal to answer for." The room stopped, not quieted, stopped. 300 Marines caught mid-bite, forks halfway, jaws halfway. The whole machinery of a packed chow hall frozen between one heartbeat and the next. A carton of milk tipped at the end of a table, and nobody reached for it. The mock clappers from the days before went the color of the tile. Salas was on his feet before the order finished, standing at attention with his throat working, tears standing in his eyes and not falling. The gunnery sergeant who had escorted her in that morning, who had thought the flag business foolish and said so, stood very straight and looked at the deck, doing fast and painful math on every word he had spoken to her all week, and finding most of it acceptable and one or two things not. The Jordanian major was on his feet with the rest, and he understood the 2 Arabic words she had given him the day before now, and his jaw was tight. Ortiz, the lance corporal who had looked away ashamed, stood with his chin up and his eyes wet, glad for once that he had only laughed and never joined. And the staff sergeant who had buried the hazing reports stood there, feeling the floor tilt under him, because he could already see where this went. And where it went was straight through him. Dixon rose from the bench in one motion. No hand on the table, no push, no lever, just the controlled lift of a body that had stood up under load 10,000 times in the dark. And every Marine in the hall, who had spent the week telling himself she was a civilian, watched her stand and understood, all at once, that they had read everything wrong. She returned the colonel's salute. The geometry of it was textbook, the same economy of motion they had all seen her use to clear an airway and right a milk carton and absorb a shoulder check. And now, finally, in context, they could read it. It had been in front of them the entire time. Maddox's face went through its stations one at a time. The smirk first, the reflex, still trying. Then confusion, the smirk sliding. Then disbelief, his head giving a small shake. No, this is not. Then recognition, the full understanding arriving like a wave hitting a seawall, that the tourist he had slapped across the face in front of 300 witnesses was the incoming commander of his battalion and a recipient of the nation's second highest award for valor. Then horror, plain and total, the blood leaving his face in a sheet. 2 military police were already at the hatch. Brandt had made that call the night before, the same night he said the call sign to an empty room. They crossed the silent hall and took Sergeant Mark Maddox by the arms, and he did not resist, because there was nothing left in him to resist with. They walked him out. The only sounds in a hall built for 300 were a single tray set down too slowly against a steel rail, and the soft pneumatic sigh of the hatch swinging shut behind Maddox. Nobody was eating. Nobody breathed. The woman the man had hit stood at the center of the room with a faint mark on her cheek and a colonel's salute still settling in the air, and the room had finally, completely seen her. After that, it moved fast. It always moves fast once the truth has feet under it. The assault was on camera and witnessed by hundreds, and there was no version of the next 48 hours that did not end with Sergeant Maddox in front of a board. The charge was preferred by the close of business. The revoked access flag was voided inside an hour, the frightened lieutenant's signature on it, now a small disaster of his own to explain. Then the rest of it came apart, because cruelty is rarely a single thread. Pulling on Maddox pulled on everything attached to him. A pattern surfaced. Salas had not been the first boot Maddox had run for sport, and 2 others came forward once it was safe to, and a staff sergeant who had quietly filed their complaints in a drawer instead of up the chain found that the drawer does not stay shut forever. Brandt handed over the passageway footage and a written statement in his own blocky hand. Lance Corporal Pierce, the clerk, came forward on his own with the falsified complaint trail, the security concern that had no evidence under it. And Pierce did it, knowing it cost him something with the senior Marines who had leaned on him, and did it anyway, which is its own kind of courage. The staff sergeant who had buried the reports was relieved by the end of the week. And Eddie Salas, 19 years old, 3 weeks in the fleet, and nearly broken by a man who should have been building him, was moved off the chopping block and onto a different track entirely. Dixon assigned him as a runner to the battalion operations shop under Brandt, where a boot with a steady nerve and a debt to pay could become something. Brandt took one look at the assignment and understood it for the gift it was to both of them. The old man had spent 7 years owing a voice he could not repay, and now the voice had handed him a frightened boy to keep, and that was the only kind of payment a debt like his ever accepted. Maddox went before a board. The combative's belt did not save him, and neither did the 2 years of running a room, because it turned out a room run by fear remembers every minute of it the instant the fear is gone, and a great many Marines who had laughed on cue found their memories suddenly clear and their statements suddenly long. The lieutenant who had countersigned the revocation kept his career by a margin and learned, cheaply, a lesson other men pay for in full. And the woman who had absorbed all of it without raising a hand was, by the end of the week, simply their commanding officer, walking the spaces in uniform. Now known. Watch what she did and didn't do, because it is the whole point. She never raised a hand, not at the serving line with the tray on the floor, not with an open palm across her face in front of the world, not once. She did not have to. The truth was always going to walk through that hatch on its own 2 legs, in its own time, and stand up in front of everyone. The only question was ever who would be standing where when it did. If that lands right in you, if you have ever waited and held your record straight while someone louder ran the room, then you already know what to do with this feeling, and you already know where the button is. 2 days later, after the change of command, after the colors had passed, and the battalion was hers in fact as well as in name, Lieutenant Colonel Dixon walked alone to the memorial wall at the edge of the battalion area in the last light of the day. She found the name without searching. Master Sergeant Diego Marrero. She rested 2 fingers below it. Light, the same 2 fingers, the same weight, and she stood there while the sky went from gold to gray. "I've got them, Diego," she said quietly. To the wall, to the name, to the man who had gone back. "I've got them now." Her phone vibrated against her hip, a secure line. She looked at the screen. It was a string of characters that resolved into a greeting only a handful of living people knew, and a call sign she had carried to a memorial service 3 years ago and grieved as dead. Ironwood, and under it, a single line. "Aiden, when you're ready, Blackthorn." She read it twice. She did not answer it yet. She closed the screen and she looked east, past the wall and the tree line and the dark coming on, toward a port city she had not seen yet and now knew she would. Then she squared her cover and turned and walked back toward the colors, and the battalion that was finally, fully hers. Every soldier carries a story that few ever hear. Listen with your heart. Thank you for staying and watching. Subscribe to Honor Tales for more.